The courtroom was packed. It wasn't a criminal trial or a headline-grabbing investigation, just a procedural hearing on the constitutionality of a state measure. Routine, technical, barely even covered by the press. But seated at the long table for the petitioners was someone who rarely went unnoticed. Pam Bondi. She hadn't come with cameras. She hadn't come for spectacle. She had come to argue, not with flash, but with conviction. Across from her sat two figures who needed no introduction. Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, seated temporarily as part of a judicial review panel. It was a rare configuration assembled for a specialized constitutional oversight matter, one that Pam Bondi had been asked to consult on, but one that quickly became something else. From the beginning, the air in the courtroom felt different. Roberts was terse, impatient. Barrett, usually measured, wore a thin smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Their questions came fast and sharp, not to probe the argument, but to undermine it. Pam didn't flinch. She knew this tone, knew what it meant to be underestimated by people who believed their titles gave them authority over truth. She answered with precision. She referenced precedent. She cited doctrine without hesitation. And still, the pushback came not on legal grounds, but personal. "Ms. Bondi," Roberts said, tilting his head, "you're not still practicing trial law, are you?" The gallery chuckled. Barrett smirked. Pam didn't respond to the laugh. She looked straight ahead. "I am practicing constitutional law," she said, "as you'll note from the brief I submitted." Barrett leaned forward. "And do you believe emotional appeals are a substitute for judicial reasoning? Because that's what your argument reads like." This time, the gallery didn't laugh. Pam didn't blink. "I believe the Constitution speaks to all Americans," she said. "And sometimes, clarity sounds emotional when you're used to hearing power dressed up in cold language." Barrett sat back. Roberts cleared his throat and moved to the next question. But something had shifted. This wasn't about legal interpretation anymore. It was about control. Pam had come prepared to argue the case. They had come prepared to belittle it. And now, with every exchange, that tension grew. What the public didn't know, not yet, was that this hearing wasn't as clean as it looked. An internal whistleblower complaint had been filed just weeks earlier, quietly, through sealed channels, alleging misconduct, involving financial disclosures, undisclosed conflicts, and procedural tampering. The allegations named several individuals. Two of them sat on the bench that day. As Pam continued presenting her case, she did so knowing what few others in that room did. She wasn't just arguing a law. She was standing in front of two judges who believed themselves untouchable and who were about to find out they weren't. Because seated in the second row was someone sent by the office of the Inspector General. Quiet, watching, taking notes, not on the argument, but on the behavior. The envelope arrived silently, passed from hand to hand behind the bench. It looked unremarkable, plain white, sealed with a standard red tab. But the moment it touched the clerk's hand, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She stepped back, paused, then leaned forward and placed it in front of Chief Justice Roberts without a word. The courtroom didn't notice. Pam Bondi was still speaking, citing precedent from a 2003 decision, but the temperature in the room shifted again. Roberts opened the envelope without ceremony. Just 2 pages inside. No attachments. No cover sheet. His eyes scanned the lines quickly. Then he stopped. Whatever composure he had held until that point faltered. Barely, but enough for those watching closely to see it. Justice Barrett leaned over slightly, peering at the document. Roberts angled it toward her. She read the top half, then leaned back again, her mouth tightening. Pam saw it all. She didn't say a word. She simply closed her folder, placed her pen neatly on the table, and folded her hands. "I believe I've made my argument clear," she said, not with finality, but with calm. Roberts didn't respond. For the first time all morning, he had no immediate question. The silence stretched a second too long. Then Barrett cleared her throat and looked up. "We'll take a brief recess before ruling on the procedural merits." No one moved. This wasn't a scheduled recess. There had been no prior announcement. But within moments, both judges rose and disappeared behind the tall oak doors that led to chambers. The room buzzed. Pam didn't turn to the gallery. She remained still, focused. The woman from the Inspector General's office quietly left her seat and exited through a side hallway. She didn't return. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The courtroom doors opened again. But it wasn't Roberts or Barrett who returned. It was the U.S. Marshal assigned to judicial security. And behind him, 2 agents in plain suits, their badges visible, but their expressions unreadable. One approached the clerk. The other stepped toward the bailiff and whispered something inaudible. The bailiff nodded, turned to the audience, and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, this session is adjourned until further notice. Please exit the courtroom in an orderly fashion." The room didn't erupt. It froze. No ruling had been given. No announcement had been made. Yet the courtroom was being cleared, and no one could explain why. Pam stood. She gathered her notes, slowly, deliberately, and placed them into her briefcase. A reporter near the back slipped out early, phone in hand, already drafting the alert that would hit every wire service within the hour. Outside the chambers, the agents waited. One knocked. Roberts opened the door himself. His expression was tight, controlled, but he didn't ask why they were there. He already knew. Barrett stood behind him, arms crossed. One agent handed over a folded document, not a warrant yet, but a formal notification of investigation. Roberts unfolded it. "Read the heading." Said nothing. Then the second agent stepped forward. "We'll need you both to come with us." Neither judge responded, because in that moment, even the most powerful robes in America meant nothing. Pam, now outside the courtroom, walked calmly through the corridor, past court staff, past attorneys, past whispered questions she didn't stop to answer. She didn't have to. The truth had already begun to surface. The holding area wasn't built for judges. It was functional. Plain walls, stiff chairs, a thin layer of institutional silence wrapped around everything. But the presence of 2 sitting Supreme Court justices inside it turned the room into something else entirely. Chief Justice John Roberts sat motionless, his tie slightly loosened. Amy Coney Barrett sat beside him, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes not meeting anyone else's. Across the room, 2 federal agents processed paperwork at a steel table. Neither rushed. The silence in the room was broken only by the low scratch of pens against forms. Outside the secure hallway, cameras had already begun to gather. No statements had been made. No charges had been read aloud. But leaks always find daylight. By mid-afternoon, news alerts had already begun. The headlines weren't definitive yet. They used cautious language. Possible judicial misconduct. Temporary detainment. Sources confirm investigation. But the truth was moving faster than the headlines. Pam Bondi was still at the courthouse, seated now in a private consultation room 2 floors below the courtroom. She had not been placed under investigation. She had not been asked to leave the premises. Instead, she had been asked to stay. A senior counsel from the Department of Justice sat across from her. "We've been watching this unfold for months," the official said quietly. "The behavior you witnessed today was part of a larger pattern. We needed someone with both credibility and clarity to stand in that courtroom." Pam didn't interrupt. She understood what he was saying, but she also understood what it meant. "You're asking me to testify," she said finally. The official nodded. "Not just testify. Assist. What you did up there today, it opened a door. Now we need to walk through it." Pam sat with the request. She wasn't afraid of pressure. She was afraid of what happened when power went unchecked and when truth was forced to ask permission. The statement she gave that afternoon was precise. She outlined the interaction, the tone, the language. She named what others might have excused as courtroom dynamics. She called it what it was, an abuse of authority wrapped in institutional robes. Upstairs, the formal charges were being prepared. The envelope had contained more than just notice. It held a signed affidavit from a former judicial clerk. It alleged that both Roberts and Barrett had knowingly participated in procedural manipulation to block specific state challenges from reaching full hearings. It included financial disclosures that showed conflict of interest and internal emails that revealed discussions about how to suppress politically inconvenient cases. What had begun as arrogance on a courtroom bench had now become the basis of a federal investigation. By evening, the story had broken nationally. The footage of Pam Bondi's courtroom exchange aired on every major network. Her calm, her refusal to match condescension with outrage, became the center of public conversation. Commentators didn't just praise her professionalism. They saw something deeper. A quiet refusal to let power define the rules of engagement. Social media lit up with a single quote, taken directly from the courtroom footage. Clarity sounds emotional when you're used to hearing power dressed up in cold language. The line was reposted thousands of times. Across political lines. Across ideologies. Because the moment had moved beyond partisanship. It was about something more fundamental. What happens when justice becomes performance? And what it takes to confront it. The meeting was held in a private wing of the Justice Department. No cameras. No press. Just 10 senior officials, seated at a long walnut table, reviewing a series of classified documents with expressions that had turned grim by the second page. At the center of the file was one name. Not Roberts. Not Barrett. But a third. A federal circuit judge whose rulings, on the surface, appeared unremarkable. But when charted against the timeline of Roberts and Barrett's decisions, they formed a pattern that couldn't be ignored. The term used was coordinated influence. The allegation wasn't just about corruption. It was about collusion. Inside the file, emails were outlined that showed strategic delays, discarded cases, decisions rewritten to align with outcomes not yet ruled on. And underneath it all, a quiet trail of financial contributions funneled through nonprofit legal foundations. Pam Bondi had not seen this file. She wasn't supposed to. But one investigator, a former clerk who'd resigned in protest a year earlier, reached out directly. Not for publicity, for protection. This isn't just about bad decisions, she told Pam over the phone. This is about an internal system that started breaking years ago. You're the first one who didn't flinch. Pam didn't respond with outrage. She responded with something quieter, something heavier. Responsibility. By the end of the week, a judiciary oversight board had been convened. Rare, unprecedented, but not illegal. Its purpose was simple: to review not just the actions of Roberts and Barrett, but the operational culture that had enabled it. The hearings were scheduled to begin in under 3 weeks. But not everyone was willing to wait. Late one evening, one of the DOJ investigators, the same one who had requested Pam's testimony, received a message through encrypted channels. Anonymous. Short. Step back quietly, or get buried with it. There was no return address. No sender ID. But the message was clear. The people at the center of this investigation weren't finished. They were cornered. And powerful. And angry. Pam was informed of the message the next morning. She listened. Then asked one question. Do we let them scare us back into silence? The agent didn't answer, because they both already knew the answer. Pam had agreed to testify. But now, she agreed to something more. Visibility. She began appearing in public again. Not as a guest on cable news. Not as a commentator. But as herself, standing at community town halls, veteran centers, law schools. Not giving speeches. Giving facts. She didn't speculate. She didn't accuse. She simply explained what she saw, what she heard, and why it mattered. The more she spoke, the more the public listened. Because for every legal mind that dismissed her as dramatic, there were 100 citizens who recognized what she was describing. A system that protected itself, until someone refused to play along. The hearing room was nothing like the courtroom. No robes. No elevated benches. Just rows of desks, long microphones, and a federal seal etched into the dark wood at the front. This was not a trial. It was oversight. And yet, the stakes felt heavier than any conviction. Pam Bondi walked in alone. She wore no legal insignia. No team flanked her sides. She carried one folder, no script. Only notes. She took her seat at the witness table. Across from her sat the bipartisan judiciary panel. Senators. Senior judges. Legal scholars. Behind them, the gallery was full. Journalists. Former clerks. Quiet figures from the Justice Department. And beyond them, the public, watching live on every major network. The chair opened with a simple prompt. Ms. Bondi, we understand this is difficult, but please begin wherever you feel is right. Pam didn't rush. She opened her folder, glanced once at the top line, and then looked up. "This isn't about a single hearing," she began. "It's about the silence we're trained to accept inside the system. It's about when authority stops listening, and about what happens when someone decides not to stay quiet." She spoke plainly. She described what she'd witnessed. The tone of the questioning, the targeted undermining, the courtroom manipulation dressed as formality. But then she did something unexpected. She named names. Not with vengeance, not with drama, but with documentation. Emails, memos, meeting records. She described how two judges had steered proceedings around personal alliances, how case assignments had been manipulated, how decisions had been delayed until friendlier panels were available. The evidence was unredacted, signed, time-stamped. What followed over the next hour was not a testimony. It was a dismantling, not of people, but of a structure, a system that had learned how to protect itself by blurring procedure into performance. By the end of the session, no one on the panel asked questions, because no one needed to. The evidence spoke louder than disbelief. Within 48 hours, the panel issued its findings. Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett were suspended pending further legal review. The third judge, the one in the documents, resigned immediately. The Justice Department issued a rare public statement, not apologizing, but acknowledging. They confirmed that the evidence presented had merit and concern at the highest levels. Judicial investigators were dispatched to audit more than 24 past rulings. The Supreme Court was placed under an internal review unprecedented in its history. But that wasn't the story the public carried forward. What stayed with them was a moment. One woman, in a hearing room, unshaken. The image of Pam Bondi, standing not with anger, but with clarity, had struck a chord the system hadn't expected. In the weeks that followed, several judges stepped down quietly. New policies were introduced about transparency in rulings. For the first time in decades, the judicial system was being discussed in public not as an untouchable pillar, but as a place in need of guardianship. Pam didn't tour news networks. She didn't give book deals or interviews. She returned to her practice, to her life, and to the belief that started it all, that truth does not need to shout to be heard. When asked months later why she kept her composure through it all, her answer was simple. You don't fight power by becoming it. You fight it by staying human. And in that stillness, she had moved more than any courtroom ruling ever could.